Hello students, this is Professor Dominic, and today I am taking you through our very last week of class, and we're ending up in the Age of Enlightenment, or as I have placed here in the slide, the so-called Age of Enlightenment, because, well, humanity was not quite enlightened that much yet. So what we're going to be doing with this particular slideshow is looking at the late 17th and the 18th centuries and some of the developments in both art and design taking place then. And then for your final, you will be answering some questions on a quiz, which I will post before next week. It will be online, as everything has for this class, and that will be on both the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment. So you'll have a vocabulary list that you can look over and use to help you with the quiz. And again, I will be getting all of that done before the end of this week. So, this so-called Age of Enlightenment followed on the heels of the Renaissance and the Baroque eras of Europe. And there were a lot of things going on at this point. People were basically calling a lot of things into question, things like the ideas of government, because up to this point, kings believed, and the majority of people believed, that kings had the divine right to rule. And now, with literacy being a thing for Europe, people were reading, people were getting bigger ideas, people were realizing that they were being oppressed. So a lot of things were coming into question. But the courts had not quite gotten caught up to this. They were still very excessive in terms of luxurious living and lavish spending. But soon people would soon begin to question the importance of both and the worth of the royalty. So what you're looking at in this slide actually is a painting of Marie Antoinette, who probably represents the greatest excesses of the Rococo period, as it came to be called. She was married to the French King Louis, and she's known for having said, "Let them eat cakes," when people told them that people told her that the poor were starving and were being taxed into poverty. And she and King Louis kept spending and spending and spending, and you can see from her sort of outrageous looking outfit, her outrageous looking hair, the heavy velvet curtains behind her, that she's really, over the top, and also remarkably out of touch, which would cost her her life later. So revolution was in the air everywhere. The United States, as we all know, became a reality when North American colonists decided they didn't want to live under English rule, and that they did not want to live under a monarchy. So the French were inspired by the Americans, and it did take them about 3 tries. They had something like 3 revolutions before they actually established a democracy. And in the meantime, we had the Haitian Revolution as well, former slaves rising up to create a new nation, and the Russian Revolution would fall after that, and shortly after that, the Bolivar movement in South America. So things were coming to a head, you might say. And the graphic and the fine arts were essential to these developments. We had the development of what is known as the diurnal, which is basically your daily newspaper. These began to appear in Europe and the United States, and this was how, before the internet, before social media, before television, before films, this was how news events would spread everywhere. And there were lots of different kinds of publications. They often, as we see today with websites, are focused on a particular community of people, of readers, and the paper would be tailored to whatever that particular interest was. So printers and publishers started to see the need for some kind of standardization, because a lot of times what we'll see, I forget exactly when the first dictionary was published, but it was somewhere around this time. Spelling from publisher to publisher was kind of iffy, and so was the way in which newspapers were laid out and the way that print was created. So they needed to think a little bit more deeply about these kinds of things. So along with newspapers, long before we had Donald Trump telling us that there's fake news, we also have posters, flyers, bulletins, advertisements, and as I said, before the internet, before social media, people knew and understood the importance of sharing information and knowledge. And it's hard to imagine now because everything is so instantaneous for us. We can get the news on our phones to us immediately. So it's hard to imagine that, several hundred years ago, the best way to spread word quickly was through printed means. But the fact remains that it was through this form that information was now beginning to spread more quickly than it ever had before. So the 17th century, or the 1600s, was not a time for great advances yet in graphic design. We still have an abundant stock of ornaments, punches, matrices, and wood blocks from the Renaissance period, but there's at this point little need for innovation. Works by William Shakespeare and other authors were printed and reached wide distribution. You're actually looking at a first edition of a book of the plays of William Shakespeare, for example. And the oldest surviving newspaper that we know of was published in Germany in 1609. This is a representation of it here in this slide. And then in 1621, England developed the Courantos, and the Courantos was basically a diurnal, a daily two-page spread newspaper. And the first American publisher was Stephen Day. He was originally a British locksmith, and he set up the first printery. They didn't call it a printers or anything like that. It was called a printery in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1639. And the first book that he printed was the whole book of Psalms, and that followed a tradition of printing religious materials to guarantee sales. And by 1775, there were 50 print shops in the North American colonies. And in the late 18th century, we actually have a lot of slave narratives being published and also the work of former slaves. So, for example, Phyllis Wheatley, she is the first known African-American poet in the United States. You might have heard of her in some of your other classes. And she could not get printed by an American printer, so she turned to an English publisher, and that publisher wanted her to be able to show what her race was. So they asked her to find an artist who would do her portrait, and that portrait had to be in black and white. It had to be linear, line-based so that it would be easier to reproduce. And she found a slave named Scipio Moorhead, and he actually illustrated her volume of poetry and did this this portrait of her that you see here on this slide. So this is probably the one remaining image we have of the woman who is known as Afrique's Muse. And this was probably a copperplate engraving. What you're looking at here is, it's hard to tell from the slide, but this would be a flat piece of copper or a thin piece of copper that would be engraved on and then inked. As you can see, it looks a little bit inked. And this is how we had illustrations in books and newspapers and handbills, and also in the form of art for private homes. So Rococo style, I referred to this early, and Rococo is a combination of rock formation and some kind of exquisite Baroque pearl, kind of an over-the-top style. And Louis XIV, he was the husband of Marie Antoinette. He ordered a committee of scholars. Oh no, was it him? Yeah, it was him. No, Louis XV, I think, was Marie Antoinette's. In any case, he wanted scholars to develop a new type for the Imprimerie Royale, which was the royal printing office, established in 1640 to restore the quality of earlier printing. And they created a style called the Roman de Roy, or the royal style of the king, and it could only be used by the royal printery, and anybody else using it could be punished by death. So, blah. So in any case, Rococo is the style that flourished in France between 1720 and 1770, and as it says in the slide, it was florid, which again, to me, that means it's overdone, it's excessive. It was intricate, it's all kinds of swirls and curls and lots of pastel colors, lavish gold and white decorations, and it found its strongest and most exaggerated expression during the reign of Louis XV. Yes, that is the husband of Marie, and in the graphic designs of the Fournier de Jeune, who also produced the first complete standardized design systems for printing. So publications reflected the extravagant, sensuous lifestyles of the misery who, as I said earlier, were completely oblivious to the misery and militancy of the poverty-stricken masses. And what you're looking at here are probably on the left is something that could be used for wallpaper. On the right is the kind of intricate decoration that you would find on walls and ceilings in the homes of wealthy people. So some features of Rococo art and architecture. One, we have elaborate curves and scrolls. Two, a lot of ornaments that are shaped like shells and plants. If you go back here, right over here, this is could be a leaf, could be a shell. These little sort of flourishes on the end kind of look like plant flourishes. Intricate patterns, delicate details, complex asymmetrical shapes, and lots of pastels, lots and lots of light pastel colors. So Rococo is meant to be, it is a style of the courts, as they say. It was the kind of art that would hang in the homes of princes and noblemen, and it was meant to be an expression of wit and frivolity. There's a lot of satire in Rococo. There's a lot of satire, there's a lot of making fun, there's some visual puns, but there's also more serious, somber, and satirical undercurrents, which we'll see in some other works. On the surface, most of the time what you see is wealthy people gathered in their homes and gardens, having picnics. Sometimes you'd see gods and goddesses engaging in amorous pursuits, lovey pursuits, lots of little cupids frolicking about. So it's a world of fantasy and grace, and that also includes a taste for the exotic and for satire. And Fragonard was one of the chief Rococo artists of the time. Here is his bathers, and you can see there's these lush, chubby white ladies frolicking here. One assumes that some kind of bathing is taking place. Another thing that we see in this century, as I said, they also like the exotic. So another thing we see is something called chinoiserie, where they are developing an interest in Chinese imagery. And so you see things like this cabinet with this very beautiful, intricately inlaid wood. And we also see this in garden design. We see it in costumes, decorative motifs in general. Those of you who might have been through the Reading area, you might have seen the pagoda. Looks kind of out of place in Reading, but the pagoda is actually an expression of this. It was built by a wealthy person who was like, yeah, a pagoda should go here. Who would think that? And in the 18th century, it's the salon that becomes the center of Parisian society and taste. And the typical salon would have been the creation of a charming, financially comfortable and witty hostess, or known as the salonière, typically in her 40s. Maybe she's a widow of independent means. Maybe her husband is off engaging in other things. And this was a woman who provided good food, a nice table, music for people of achievement in different fields who would visit the hotel, as it was called, and guests engaged in the art of conversation and social and intellectual interchange. And in the 17th century, the most important salon was that of Madame de Rambouillet, who wished to exert a civilizing influence on society. And then by the next century, the salon was part of Paris social life, one in which women played the dominant role, and also a way in which artists could get their work seen. If you couldn't get into the salon, you were screwed. And then in contrast to all of this nutty Rococo stuff going on, we have serious advances in music and in science. So we have the music of Antonio Vivaldi, Johann Sebastian Bach, Franz Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and then in science, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz developed calculus, and Joseph Priestley discovered oxygen, and Edmund Halley identified the comet that bears his name. And there's also technological developments such as mechanized spinning and the steam engine, and these are laying the foundations for the Industrial Revolution to come. And satire, which I mentioned before, is a feature of certain Rococo artists, had leading literary exponents in Jonathan Swift in Ireland and Voltaire in France. So we're going to look at some Rococo painting now, and the leading Rococo painter was Antoine Watteau, who was born in the country of Flanders, but he spent most of his professional life in France, and you can see here that there's a lot of pastels and so forth in this painting, and he also worked in the painterly colorist tradition of Rubens, who liked voluptuous women and rich materials, but unlike Rubens, his figures in this particular painting are fairly thin, they're graceful, and he was best known for what's known as a fête galante, a painting of a festive gathering where you have aristocrats relaxing in outdoor settings. And I think this is really interesting here, where you've got musicians entertaining some wealthy people, and then over here you have this poor servant person who looks like maybe they're getting wine out of the ice bucket or something for everyone else. And so this is the wistful side of Watteau, and this is the more serious side of Rococo. This is known as Guy. He is a sad harlequin, not Harley Quinn, harlequin. And in this case, a harlequin would be a comic actor portraying a comic lover, but here it looks as though he's not performing and he's actually sad. You know, like maybe he has been abandoned by his love. And all of these, again, wealthy people are gathered around him, but he's isolated in the center here. He's got beautiful satin bows on his shoes, and he's got a very fluffy lacy collar at his neck, very elaborate coat, but again, he looks very sad and bereft. So he is kind of in contrast to the bright colors and the four figures around him, like he's all dressed up with nowhere to go. And I mentioned Fragonard before. This is one of the more famous Fragonard paintings called The Swing. And this here is where we get kind of double entendre and a little bit of a sexy story. So if you look closely at this, there's several figures here. We've got this, here's my arrow, we've got this guy who's pushing the woman in the swing, and her fluffy clothes are, you know, billowing out around her, and she's so carefree that she's losing her shoe. And then down here, hidden in the bushes, is this guy who could be looking up her skirt. Meanwhile, Cupid, or a type of Cupid, is over here going shh. So basically, the inner meaning of this story is this is the husband, the unknowing husband, pushing the swing. Little frolicking Cupids over here, and this Cupid over here saying, shh, don't tell, you know, something naughty's afoot here. And the shoe, as it says, and her hat, the feather in her hat, are both phallic and vaginal. So the hat is meant to be a phallic symbol. The shoe is a vaginal one. So again, something not quite, you know, up front is going on here. And then these are Cupids clinging to a dolphin. So Fragonard is using classical imagery to also give a serious underpinning of, you know, a frivolous erotic theme. I still think it's all about, you know, nonsense is going on here. And then this is the king. This is Louis XIV, the king before Marie Antoinette. painted by Hyacinth Rigaud. Hyacinth is one of the few female painters at this time, but we do have a lot of women painting royalty as court painters. And I'm showing you this to kind of show you how over the top the royalty was. So he's wearing an ermine cape. All of this white, this is white fur under here with velvet on the top, velvet curtains, and men dressed more outrageously in some ways than women did. So he's wearing stockings to show off his shapely legs, and he's wearing high heels because he was actually short, but it also they're expensive shoes. Ordinary people don't wear high heels. The motif that you see, the pattern repeated here and on his overcloak, is the fleur-de-lis, which is the symbol of French royalty. So he's also holding a scepter, and he's got a sword, and he's very much showing himself off as the king. And the royalty were very much trying to use art as propaganda to show off their status and so forth. But once again, they're completely out of touch with what's going on in the hearts and minds of their people. And so Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, that should be a B between the L and the R there, or the E and the R, Lebrun. Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun was one of the major court painters to the aristocracy, particularly Marie Antoinette, who you see here. So Vigée-Lebrun befriended a lot of the monarchs and benefited from her patronage. And I think at some point, Lebrun actually spent time during the French Revolution in the Bastille. She was imprisoned for her friendship to the Queen, and she's probably lucky that she didn't lose her head like the Queen did. But once again, here is Marie wearing, outrageous costumes. To wear these dresses, the women would have to wear these like cage-like things underneath the skirts in order to make them poof out like that. So lots and lots. It's silk, so that's a very costly fabric, lots and lots of it. She's got white ostrich feathers on her hat. Again, very, very expensive. She's wearing a powdered wig. And she had a reputation for being aloof, so she's not really looking directly at us. She's kind of looking, off into the distance. And Vigée-Lebrun would do a lot of portraits of her, trying to make her sympathetic. I don't think I have it in here, but there's actually a picture where there's a reference to the fact that she had lost one of her children in childbirth, trying to make her, more palatable to her subjects. Now, William Hogarth is a whole different ball of wax here. He is a whole different expression of British Rococo. Here, he's making fun of the wealthy. So he did a series of paintings called Mariage à la Mode, and this pokes fun at hypocritical commitments to the marriage contract. So what's going on here? So the husband has come home after a night of frolicking and carousing, and on his neck he's got a black mark, which is supposed to indicate that he's already gotten syphilis. So he's not quite ill, but he's coming home and sort of collapsing on the chair like, oh, I'm so exhausted from, having sex with floozies all night. And then the family dog is sniffing at his pocket, which looks like it has a panty or something coming out of it. That's not very discreet. And then meanwhile, the wife has been, having fun on her own. Over here, supposedly she's been having a music lesson. So what you see is the music chair is knocked over, musical instrument is knocked over. Wife, no, she still has her, I think she might be missing a shoe actually. So again, a sexual reference. And the musician himself is like trying to rush out of there, trying to make a speedy exit. So, there's a lot going on there. So he's making fun of the wealthy here and saying, they're just, full of their own pursuits, and they're as sick as their sins, basically. So another style, which is kind of the complete opposite of Rococo, is Neoclassicism. And this comes up during the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Western Europe. And a lot of styles were competing for primacy. And in France, they called this the true style. As I said, it's a reaction against Rococo. And basically, they're trying to go for the classical restraint that we would see in things like beautiful white marble Roman statues. Now, this comes out of a misunderstanding that people had of the Roman ruins. When they were finding Roman and Greek statues, they often appeared to be completely white. But the fact is, through later examination and testing, it's been revealed that these statues were often painted in bright colors. However, to the neoclassicists, it looked restrained and refined and elegant. And so neoclassicism begins to emerge. And as I mentioned, France did not quite get on the democracy train at around the same time as the United States, because we have the rise of Napoleon. And so with Napoleon, neoclassicism becomes the imperial style. So Angelica Kauffman, again, a female painter, she was actually a child prodigy, and she became one of the most important and prolific neoclassical painters. And one of the things we see in neoclassical painting gone are all the ruffles and frills and so forth. Instead, we have biblical stories and neoclassical stories that are moral. So this is Cornelia pointing to her children as treasures, and it's refinement. The mood is a bit romantic, which is another style that is coming up at this time, where the colors are very, very bright and intense, as you can see in these reds. But back here we've got these columns that look like Greco-Roman columns. So here's where we have this sort of classical content with a romantic mood. And then the leading neoclassical painter was Jacques-Louis David, and he was trying to appeal to Republican sentiments that were associated with classical antiquity. Well, what does that mean in English? Well, they were trying for a style of democracy that they believed came out of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And so this is actually an event from the Roman tradition in which honor and self-sacrifice prevailed. And what's interesting is this was painted for a wealthy person, but it's actually meant to be a call to arms to the French people to join in the French Revolution and to overthrow the monarchy. So what we have is an old story, a story from Roman times. These are the brothers of the Horatii over here, and this is their father. And they are pledging to go to war. These are their swords. So they're pledging on their swords in the style of ancient Rome, come back with your shield or on it. So in other words, succeed or die. And back over here are the women of the family who are weeping because the men are going off to war. So in any case, this painting was commissioned by Louis XVI, and supposed to appeal to the king and his Republican opponents, which is interesting. So it's kind of ironic. And the painting was approved to hang in the palace. But again, as I said, it's meant to be a call to arms for the French people. So kind of weird. And Jacques-Louis David was somebody who kind of played both sides against the middle. He too, like Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, spent some time in the Bastille. I believe it was Napoleon who freed him. And so here we have Napoleon at St. Bernard Pass. He is riding a charging stallion across the Alps, and he is meant to be echoing Roman equestrian portraits, basically a guy on a horse. And Napoleon here is wearing full military regalia. He's sitting on this splendid horse, and you know, everything is captured in very precise detail. You've got, it's romantic in that the wind is whipping around, the colors are very rich, and again, this is Jacques-Louis David. As I said, he kind of played all sides against each other, so Jacques-Louis David becomes Napoleon's court painter, and there he is. And then, about 15 years after the outbreak of the French Revolution, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of France. And again, he was very savvy with the way that you could use art as propaganda. So this is a painting by not Jean-Louis Jacques Louis David, but by Ingres, Ingres, not Ingers, but Ingres. And Ingres was a master of capturing rich textures and kind of doing a fool the eye thing where if you ran your hand across this canvas, it would be perfectly smooth, but it appears as though you could reach out and touch the velvet of the outer part of the robe. You could reach out and feel the softness of the ermine underneath. And so this is what's very interesting about this is Napoleon is declaring himself emperor with this painting, and he's also kind of reminiscent of how Jesus would be depicted in church paintings in ancient Byzantine icons, but also through the Renaissance as well. So he is meant to be imbued with the power of Rome and also sanctioned by God to lead. So there he is. And then this is in the United States. This is a very interesting portrait. So neoclassical style did happen in the United States, but it didn't really reach the United States until 1841. So this was commissioned in 1832 by Horatio Greenough. He was America's first professional sculptor who was living in Italy. He would have been influenced by the art that was going on. He was looking at a lot of Greek and Roman statues, a lot of which are nude. And so what we see here is a nude statue of George Washington, which did not fly with the people of the time. And so it was placed outside the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and it began to erode there. And then it was eventually moved inside the National Museum of American Art, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. So you can still see it. But it, like I said, it was not really approved of. So that is the end of this little lecture, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And I am going to put together a vocab list for this particular section, and then the materials on that vocab list and the things that are in this slideshow will be what you want to look at for the final quiz. So I wish you all a good day, and I will talk with you soon.